Even as the world was trying to decode the Canadian government's increasingly complex puzzle of what exactly is credible allegation, guess what happened? Justin Trudeau just can't seem to catch a break. Already under fire for embarrassing his country, he went and did something even better. He met and honored a Ukrainian veteran, Yaroslav Hunka, who happened to be fighting for the Nazis during World War II. Worse, the entire House of Commons, which is their equivalent of the Parliament in India, gave a standing ovation to the former Nazi soldier. Following this, the Canadian Prime Minister said he didn't have knowledge of the man's antecedents, leaving the Speaker, Anthony Rota, to take the fall and the responsibility for the soldier's presence. Many are now asking, how is it that Mr. Trudeau has divined the involvement of so-called Indian agents in the murder of gangster Nijjar in Canada, but can't check the background of a man that he himself meets and applauds? A man who entered his own country's House of Commons. Well, that's not the only thing the Canadian Prime Minister is seemingly unaware of. He also is unaware of a campaign that has been launched by 20 Khalistani groups to shut down Indian missions globally. Following this, Indian diplomats have been put on alert, fearing violence against them. These protests, by the way, are also spearheaded by a man that Canada is currently sheltering. Gurpatwant Singh Pannu of the proscribed Sikhs for Justice. But of course, the focus now turns back on the alleged evidence against India and how much can it be trusted. After the Canadian PM, now Canada's Defence Minister, Bill Blair, has said that his country has credible evidence to back the claim that India was involved in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. In June, in fact yesterday, the New York Times reported that in the aftermath of Nijjar's killing, US intelligence agencies offered their Canadian counterparts context that helped Canada conclude that India had been involved. Yet, what appears to be the smoking gun was eventually brought in by Canada itself. So the simple question is this: who exactly brought in the evidence which connected Nijjar's killing to India? And even now, does Mr. Trudeau and his government have any evidence at all? And is he planning to show it to the world? Joining us now on India Upfront is Michael Rubin, former official at the Pentagon and senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Phil Gursky, former senior terrorism strategic analyst at the CSIS and president and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting. Thanks very much, both gentlemen, for joining me. I want to start by asking you, Mr. Rubin, what do you make of Canada's allegations so far, especially their choice of words, with the Prime Minister saying there are credible allegations, to the Defence Minister saying, and I quote, if the intelligence we have received is proven to be accurate, then there is a very significant concern that Canada will have?
Well, there's just still too much that's unclear about this. We're at a point in time in our society where an intelligence agency saying, trust me, is not enough. And that's certainly the case when it comes to signals intelligence and even with human intelligence. You know, seldom, intelligence is like a jigsaw puzzle. You have pieces and seldom do you have a clear picture. And so much is open to interpretation. Either the Canadian government needs to put forward what they have in order to allow others to basically see whether they agree with the interpretation, or they need to stand down on their interpretations, on their accusations.
Mr. Gursky, since you've been a part of the establishment, first tell our viewers, is there any precedence for something like this, for a Prime Minister to go public with what at best right now are credible allegations?
You know, when you work in intelligence, you're always nervous when politicians take your information and go public with it. Information that's disclosed publicly can often lead to the loss of sources, be it human sources or signal sources, as Mr. Rubin just identified. There have been times in Canadian history where intelligence has been used publicly, but normally with the way the process works is that if you have intelligence suggesting criminal activity is possible, in Canada at least, That's turned over to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is a police organization, which collects to an evidentiary standard, which intelligence is not in Canada. And that may go forward with possible criminal charges. So these are very serious allegations. And as somebody who worked for more than 3 decades in intelligence, you're always quite nervous when politicians elect to release certain pieces of information, but not the whole story.
Would you say, as a follow-up, that this is an unfortunate politicization of what could have been and should have been an intelligence operation and may actually backfire?
It's really hard for me to say. I don't want to speak for Mr. Trudeau or for politicians, never having worked in that particular part of Canada. Could it have been done better? Probably. But they chose to act because they were afraid the information would be leaked anyhow, and they wanted to get ahead of the curve, I suppose.
Ordinarily, what would be the process? Since obviously India is not a hostile state, Canada and India are allies. What would have been the process if indeed there was intelligence of this nature and action needed to be taken?
I would assume, again, never having worked in politics or in foreign affairs, for example, that if we had information in this regard, we would have shared it on a bilateral level with India. Show them exactly what we have and have India respond to that. I don't know that that attempt was made or not made, but that would be the normal course of affairs as I understand the way the diplomacy works.
Michael Rubin, do you, as someone who's worked in American intelligence, think that right now America is in a bit of a bind, considering that now information emerges that the initial quote-unquote context of this information was given by the US as a part of Five Eyes intelligence sharing process, and then Canada developed on it?
Well, certainly that's what the New York Times is saying, that they weren't aware of the plot until after it happened, but they're giving some context. At the same time, it's the Canadian intelligence service, which supposedly is drawing the direct link, the smoking gun, and so forth. Again, the United States would be aghast if any of its sources and methods were shared as a result of this political brouhaha. But at the same time, I just need to caution, intelligence is never or is seldom as clean and as clear as many in the public imagine. And therefore, even if there were phone intercepts, for example, complaining about Nijar, and that was what some intelligence analysts say is context, that's not a smoking gun. That's certainly not to an evidentiary standard. It should be no surprise to anyone, however, that collection is going on with regard to some of these figures, even among allied states.
Can you throw more light on that, Phil Gurski? What exactly is the process of this entire intelligence sharing within the establishment?
Right. So there's 2 ways. As Mr. Rubin said, I mean, Canada and the United States have been part of the Five Eyes Alliance for many years now. It is the gold standard of intelligence sharing on the planet. We've been doing this for many, many decades. Very sensitive intelligence is shared. We cooperate and collaborate on an awful lot of files. But in Canada, as Mr. Rubin also alluded, we make a very clear distinction between intelligence and evidence. Intelligence is gathered at an earlier stage to indicate that something may or may not happen. We in Canada have mechanisms whereby intelligence can be shared with law enforcement, but not used in an investigation because it's not collected to an evidentiary standard. Law enforcement must collect to a higher standard to be used in a court, whether it's a criminal court or civil court, or whatever. So there are well-established practices that have been going on for many, many years now, whereby an organization such as CSIS, where I work, can say to the RCMP, look, here's what we know about X, Y, or Z. And if the RCMP feels that there's possible criminal intent there, then they can create their own independent, not joint, independent parallel investigation into that person or persons to determine if criminal charges are warranted.
So what exactly is the difference between giving context for allegations and actually saying that these are credible allegations?
I have no idea. I'm sorry. It means nothing to me. As Mr. Rubin said, intelligence is really great. I mean, I spent more than 3 decades in it, but it's very seldom do you have the complete 100. I think what he used is an analogy of a jigsaw puzzle is great. The problem is that you have pieces, you have no idea how big the puzzle is, nor do you know which pieces you have. It could be pieces 1, 2, and 3, or pieces 1, 3,000, and 400,000. But that's so you're trying to collect more intelligence, more information to complete that puzzle, without always knowing what the puzzle is supposed to look like at the end of the day. So, yeah, again, to reiterate, you rarely have that complete picture that can go forward.
Most of the world right now is completely foxed by exactly what are these credible allegations and what does that even mean, exactly like you. But Michael Rubin, what do you make of President Joe Biden's position right now? Because if one is to believe that America was a part of this intelligence gathering against Indian officials, how does the U.S. explain its position to India?
Well, firstly, behind the scenes, I don't think that there's that much tension here between the United States and India. Make no mistake, the United States, in all likelihood, is collecting intelligence against India or on India every single day. But for that matter, India is collecting intelligence on the United States. This is something that intelligence agencies do. Friendly intelligence agencies then share. Hostile intelligence agencies are a different story, but we are not hostile intelligence agencies. So what we see, according to the New York Times, where material was presented after the fact, was it didn't raise to the concern or strike alarms inside the United States intelligence community. When Najjar was murdered, they said, oh, there's some information here. Maybe Canada wants to take a look at it. And that was the end of it. Now, what I would say is that the United States, the Biden administration, has been caught by surprise about this, as has much of the world. It's been very reactive. And given that Canada is an important ally, India is an important strategic ally, I think the United States' goal is going to simply be to tone down the volume on this, to try to get much of the investigation and much of the discussion out of the public eye as we move forward. At the very least, I would say that the biggest silver lining to what we will have is no longer will Americans, or frankly many in the West, not take Khalistani separatism and terrorism seriously. It's now fully on our radar screen.
Would you say then, Michael Rubin, that America was also blindsided by the extrapolation of intelligence it shared in good faith by Canada to level those charges against India?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, certainly we were blindsided by the crisis, but the fact of the matter is a murder did happen. We don't know what happened there, but it wasn't the sharing of intelligence and a random extrapolation. There was a murder that occurred, and that's what caused the tempest in the teapot.
Now, here's the counter view, Mr. Gursky. Here is somebody who was declared a terrorist by India 3 years ago. Canada knew this. 1 year ago, we also put a cash reward for any information leading to him. Why is it that Canadian intelligence and the government in particular, knowing that he is finding shelter on Canadian soil, refuse to take any action? What about India's sovereignty?
I can't speak for the Canadian government. I'll also simply point out that, you know, the word terrorism is a very slippery term. I mean, I've written 6 books on terrorism since my retirement from the security service. There's no agreed definition on what a terrorist is or what a terrorist isn't. Each nation has its own legal definitions, its own, sort of informal definitions. So India may very well have shared the information with Canada, and Canada may, and I stress may because I have no inside information, may have decided that it didn't agree with the definition of Mr. Najjar as a terrorist, preferring to call him an activist, for example. But these are very slippery terms, and I think that this is what makes it more difficult, is that we can't agree on the very definition of what a terrorist is, then how can we agree on what action to take internationally?
But for example, at that very Gurdwara in Surrey, where Hardeep Nijjar was killed, until yesterday, there were posters with the pictures of Indian diplomats asking for their assassination. Can that be defended in the name of free speech?
I don't believe so. As a Canadian citizen, I do not want to see anybody who we would all agree has acted as a terrorist should be praised or posters put up. That is unacceptable. Why no action was taken? That's not a question that I can answer. As I'm no longer a Canadian public employee. No longer do I work for the British Columbia government. But it is my opinion, purely as a citizen, that no, we shouldn't be glorifying the acts of terrorism, and that action should be taken to ensure that these kinds of activities are not allowed on Canadian soil.
And it didn't stop at the glorification of people like Nijjar, but also, Mr. Rubin, about the direct threat to Indian diplomats. Again, isn't there a question to be answered by the Canadian government about what is being done to protect India's interests and India's sovereignty and acting against people who are directly threatening Indian assets in Canada?
Short answer is yes. Look, I can speak more to American law than I can to Canadian law. But in the United States, incitement to violence is a crime, and there's limits on free speech. I mean, the famous example is you also can't scream fire in a crowded theater. That's not free speech. That's incitement to something much more malevolent. So in this case, I presume that you have similar laws in Canada. Certainly, it behooves the government of Canada to fully protect any diplomat that is on its soil, Indian, Pakistani, or any other diplomat. This is just the basic responsibility that goes back, I mean, centuries in terms of diplomacy and diplomatic conventions.
Do you also find it curious because now, again, there are reports that just before his killing in June, Canadian intelligence reached out to Hardeep Nijjar and warned him of a threat to his life, the same person who they had refused to act against, even though he was accused of murder in India, was helped by Canadian intelligence and given a warning about, hey, you know, you might be threatened. Michael Rubin?
Well, in this case, look, there's a much broader context there, and this is why Prime Minister Trudeau should be much cautious. Of course, you also had the murder of Rapudaman Singh Malik, and Nijjar was alleged to have had a hand in at least inciting that, if not having a much greater role in that. And so you did have a much greater, if you will, tension or violent dynamic ongoing within the Sikh community. Therefore, there are many other possibilities as to what may have occurred and why someone allegedly was warned. I would say in Sacramento in California back in April, we had, I think, 15 or 16 Sikhs arrested for plotting communal intra-gang violence. Certainly, this is a problem that spans both California and British Columbia, and it's something that bears watching on the part of the intelligence community and the security services. At the same time, just finally, I would say that we have to be careful about some of these reports, because some of these reports given by a brother of this gentleman or that gentleman may also not be truthful. People might be trying to play the media after the fact.
Mr. Gursky, what is your experience while being an intelligence officer of the Khalistan movement and more specifically the violence, especially in the 4 provinces where there is a large Sikh population? There are many journalists who have spoken about how the Khalistan project has been over 2 decades old in Canada. Is it being ignored or is it deliberately being downplayed for political considerations?
It's important to start with the facts. You know, prior to 9/11, the single greatest act of terrorism and aviation terrorism history was planned and perpetrated in Canada, the Air India attack in 1985. I was working in intelligence back then. It was a terrible act, and we didn't stop it, and that's a failure on our part. And those of us who work in intelligence are only as good as our last failure. It's not fair, but it's the way it goes. You know, I've always said that, you know, when it comes to terrorism, terrorism is linked to grievances, and if those grievances are not resolved to the satisfaction of all, terrorism and terrorism movements seldom disappear forever. So I'm suggesting, and I have not followed Khalistani extremism for a very long time, so I can't speak to the status of it now. I'll simply say that I'm sure there are individuals for whom an independent Khalistan in India is the ultimate goal, and there's a smaller number amongst those activists who believe that violence is necessary to achieve that goal. In other words, it is entirely possible that there are still individuals here in Canada who not only want to see an independent Khalistan, but are willing possibly to use violence to achieve that goal. I don't know what those numbers are, but certainly the history of terrorism in the 20th century, 21st century, say to me that these groups rarely down tools because they haven't achieved their ultimate goals. And ultimate goals may be a variety of things, and they're convinced the only way to achieve those goals is to use violence.
But isn't it inimical to Canada's interests as well? Because ultimately, when the Kanishka bombing happened, the people who were killed were Canadian citizens, and yet we're in a position where in 2023, Even as we speak, a man called Gurpatwant Singh Pannu is being allowed to carry out nationwide protests and asking for the shutting down of Indian missions across the globe. How can Canada allow that?
There's a very fine line, and the Prime Minister, I think, hasn't done it very well, but there's a very fine line between, as Mr. Rubin said, freedom of expression, which we hold very dearly in the United States and Canada and other parts of the world, and the advocacy of violence for some kind of political end. It's often not easy to see where that line lies, but we have to do our utmost to make sure that yes, you have a right to protest, you have a right to say things, but no, you do not have a right to advocate or use violence in the furtherance of those goals.
But didn't the Babbar Khasla International or the Khalistan Tiger Force cross that line in the very moment that they bombed Kanishka?
It certainly did, almost 4 years ago. But again, I can't speak to the current status of Babbar Khasla International or other groups because I simply haven't followed them in recent years. But again, the bottom line is that under Canadian law, if you advocate the use of violence for a political, ideological, or religious end, that constitutes terrorism under the Canadian Criminal Code and can be prosecuted in a Canadian court.
Michael Rubin, now there's another very interesting parallel conversation that is happening. Of course, India has categorically said that the claims made by Mr. Trudeau are absurd and there is no truth to them. But there are also people asking, when America does the same to Ayman al-Zawahiri, it is seen as cracking down on terror. But when there are similar allegations made against India, it is seen as an attack on sovereignty. What do you make of this argument?
I think that argument is valid. Look, on one hand, you don't want to have an open season where assassination and targeted murder can occur on state order anywhere in the world. But at the other point, the United States has done it, Israel has done it, India in this case is alleged to have done it. I would categorize democracies with the rule of law differently than I would, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran trying to assassinate Brian Hook, former special Iran envoy, or former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, or Russia trying to assassinate or very successfully assassinating dissidents inside the United Kingdom. There's a functional difference here, and I do think that India is right to suggest that this is a man who is documented to have blood on his hands, and that Canada was not being very responsive about it. The Khalistan movement does not have much legitimacy inside Punjab itself. It's mostly a project of some fringe diaspora folks now, and therefore India has every right to be frustrated that perhaps they're being treated with a double standard.
What do you make of that argument, Mr. Gursky?
You raised some good points. We have to be careful with to what extent states act, and I think Mr. Rubin put it very, very well in terms of we don't want to see an open season or a free-for-all where State A decides to take action in State B because it believes that State B is not, working quickly enough to satisfy its demands or its interests. We do have international law and order. We have systems in place, and ideally those systems should be allowed to work. I understand the frustration. I certainly agree with Mr. Rubin that the Khalistani project does appear to be largely a diaspora one. We have a large Sikh diaspora here in Canada, and perhaps more should have been done to ensure that they didn't advocate violence or glorify people who had killed innocent Canadians almost 40 years ago. But there are rules in place, and there are rules in place for a reason, and that's how the international order works, and those rules should be applied wherever possible.
Thanks very much for joining us, Mr. Michael Rubin, Mr. Phil Gursky. Very, very interesting insights from two very different continents, but two countries which are equally involved in this global crisis that everyone at this point seems to be embroiled in. Thanks much.
Thank you.